Reports from the field came in almost immediately. One tank battalion near St. Lo noted that their Rhino-fitted Shermans broke through hedgerows like paper. Infantrymen, used to crawling through gaps under fire, could now follow armor directly into the next field. German defenses built to face the openings in hedges were now flanked from unpredictable directions. Bradley saw opportunity. The operation that had been postponed twice because of rain, the long-awaited breakout from the Normandy lodgment, would now hinge on speed and surprise. Operation Cobra, originally scheduled for late July, would rely on overwhelming air bombardment followed by an armored thrust through the weakened German line. The success of that thrust, however, depended on movement, on the ability of American tanks to exploit the gap before German reserves could regroup. Culin's invention, forged in a hedgerow at night, was about to become a cornerstone of that maneuver. By July 25, 1944, as the skies over St. Lo filled with thousands of bombers, hundreds of Shermans waited behind the lines, their steel teeth glinting in the morning sun. In less than 2 weeks, an Army mechanic's improvised idea had transformed from a field fix to a frontline revolution. And now, as the bombers droned overhead and the hedgerows trembled under the bombardment, those Rhino-fitted Shermans prepared to charge through the green walls of Normandy, into the decisive phase of the campaign. What came next would prove whether ingenuity could alter the course of a battle. War, at its core, is a test of human adaptability. The story of the Rhino cutters is not only about steel and welding torches. It is about men in fatigue-stained uniforms refusing to accept paralysis. The tank crews of Normandy were exhausted. They had landed in June full of confidence, trained for open warfare. But by July, their world had shrunk to 10-yard bursts of terror. Each hedgerow was an ambush waiting to happen. The Germans fired Panzerfausts from invisible positions, and each time a Sherman bellied on a hedgerow, its underside became a glowing target. Many crews developed rituals before breaching. One man watching the hedgerow's crest, another scanning for movement, all while praying the next explosion would be out there, not beneath their turret. Survivors spoke of hearing the hollow thump of German rockets just before impact, of smelling the gasoline ignite inside the compartment. When Sergeant Culin's invention appeared, it wasn't seen as an engineering marvel. It was a lifeline, a way to take back control. Tankers began welding the blades themselves, using torches in the mud, sharing cigarettes as sparks fell on their sleeves. Mechanics from ordnance units, who seldom saw the front line, suddenly found themselves heroes of innovation. They called their work Rhino fitting. In photographs, grinning men posed beside their modified Shermans, teeth bared, names painted in chalk: Carolina Cutter, Hedgehog, Bokage Buster. Behind each crude weld was a sense of ownership. It wasn't an order from above, but an idea from within. Soldiers felt it was their solution. Proof that ingenuity didn't belong only to generals or scientists. The field fix became a symbol of agency, in a war that often stripped men of it. And with that sense of agency came confidence. When the cutters worked, when a tank crashed through a hedgerow and caught the Germans by surprise, crews felt invincible again. The claustrophobic fields opened up. The smell of burning cordite was no longer fear, but fuel. This emotional shift, from hunted to hunter, mattered more than any blueprint. Before the Rhino, U.S. tactics in the bocage were painfully predictable. Infantry advanced through narrow gaps, covered by tanks forced to expose themselves before firing. Each engagement was frontal, bloody, and slow. German defenders exploited that rhythm. Machine guns were zeroed on known crossings. Anti-tank guns waited at the next field's opening. A single ambush could halt an entire battalion. The Rhino cutter shattered that pattern. Suddenly, A Sherman could burst through any point in the hedge line. Commanders could plan attacks that the enemy couldn't anticipate. Instead of bottlenecking at the obvious gaps, tanks created their own breaches, often emerging behind or beside German positions. The tactical effect was profound. Infantry and armor began coordinating in a new way. Instead of waiting for engineers, tanks now led the advance. The first Sherman, fitted with a Rhino, would punch through, its 75 mm gun ready the instant it cleared the hedge. Infantrymen followed close behind, using the tank as a moving wall. Each field became a short, violent chessboard. The advantage now belonged to whoever could move first. And the Rhino gave that edge to the Americans, reports from the 2nd Armored Division describe. German anti-tank crews stunned by tanks, appearing out of solid hedge. Entire defensive lines collapsed before they could pivot. The Germans, accustomed to fixed points of engagement, found their carefully rehearsed fire plans obsolete. In tactical terms, the Rhino restored initiative. The First Army's doctrine of aggressive contact, long stifled by terrain, came alive again. Units developed improvised drills. Breach, clear, pivot. Every movement synchronized between tankers, riflemen and radio operators. The hedgerow, once a defensive gift to the Germans, became a trap for them instead. The lesson was unmistakable. In modern war, movement equals survival. There was no blueprint, no engineering team in a lab. Only welders, torches, and trial by fire. Yet, the Rhino cutter remains one of the most effective battlefield engineering innovations of the Second World War. Technically, it was brilliant in its simplicity. The average cutter consisted of 4 prongs, each about 18 inches long, welded to a reinforcing bar beneath the tank's lower front plate. They were angled slightly downward, forming a wedge capable of slicing through earthen berms and root. Networks.tests showed that when the Sherman approached, a hedgerow at moderate speed, around 5 to 8 miles per hour, the prongs would cut through without significant strain on the suspension. More importantly, the tank's gun remained level, allowing immediate engagement after breaching. Unlike the dozer blades previously tested, the Rhino didn't hinder maneuverability. It was light enough not to overload the tank's front suspension and rugged enough to withstand repeated impacts. In battlefield conditions, maintenance crews reported only minor repairs, mostly cracked welds or bent teeth after multiple breaches. Its design was so effective that it spread across variants: M4A1s, M4A3s, even light M5 Stuarts received modified versions. Some crews added extra tines or reinforced the welds with scrap rebar. By war's end, over 500 Rhino kits had been officially documented, though the real number was likely far higher. Field improvisations seldom left records. In hindsight, it was not the most technologically advanced innovation of the war, but it embodied something more powerful: adaptation in contact. It showed that battlefield technology wasn't always born in laboratories. Sometimes it was born from necessity, heat, and human will. And it was about to prove its worth in the most violent test of all: Operation Cobra. In every war, innovation can wither without leadership willing to see its potential. The story of the Rhino cutter might have ended as a footnote, a clever field trick, had it not been for the swift, decisive reaction from the U.S. First Army's command chain. General Omar N. Bradley, commanding 1st U.S. Army, understood the rhythm of war better than most. A methodical planner, cautious yet decisive when opportunity appeared, Bradley recognized that stagnation in the bocage was eroding not just time, but morale. When he saw Culin's improvised prototype tear through a hedgerow before his eyes, he grasped its value immediately. He didn't convene a committee. He issued an order. Bradley directed that every available workshop and ordnance unit in Normandy produce the cutter en masse. He knew the breakout, Operation Cobra, hinged on speed, And this device was speed in steel form. Behind Bradley, men like Colonel John Madaris and Colonel Holger Toftoy transformed vision into execution. They coordinated welding operations across multiple corps areas, allocating materials, scheduling shifts, and setting up what Madaris called an industrial miracle on the edge of a battlefield. This fusion of leadership and lower-rank creativity was rare in wartime bureaucracies. Yet, in July 1944, it became a defining feature of American command culture. Bradley's staff didn't overanalyze the invention, they empowered it. They didn't require prototypes from Aberdeen Proving Ground, they trusted the frontline sergeant who built it from scrap. That flexibility became a lesson in wartime agility. Historians later noted that the Rhino episode revealed the strength of the American system. Decentralized initiative supported by centralized logistics. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed soldiers' ideas to reach the command tent and, within days, the assembly line. By the time Operation Cobra began, Bradley's order had been fulfilled beyond expectation. An estimated 60% of First Army tanks carried cutters. In the hedgerows of Normandy, leadership had turned improvisation into doctrine. For weeks, German defenders in Normandy had grown confident in the bocage. They had mastered the terrain. Machine gun nests and 80 mm positions turned each field into a box of death. To them, Allied armor was predictable. Tanks could only enter through existing gaps, and those gaps were covered by mines, guns, and Panzerfaust teams. But on the morning of July 25, 1944, the rhythm changed. Survivors from the German 303rd Infantry Division later recalled the moment. "They came through the hedge itself," one veteran wrote in a post-war account. "We did not believe it possible." What had seemed impenetrable was suddenly porous. Sherman tanks, which had once paused and struggled against the hedges, now crashed through them like battering rams, their guns already leveled. The suddenness of their appearance shattered the carefully calibrated German fields of fire. Machine gun teams positioned for frontal ambushes found tanks emerging from their flanks. Anti-tank crews couldn't traverse their guns in time. Entire hedgerow positions collapsed before effective resistance could form. The psychological shock was immense. The hedgerow, which had been the Germans' greatest ally, had turned traitor. Their confidence, built on terrain advantage, dissolved overnight. In many after-action reports, German officers blamed the loss of tactical control on what they described as unexpected mobility. One report by the 2nd Panzer Lehr Division noted that American tanks were operating with abnormal flexibility, bursting through walls where no gap existed. The Rhino effect wasn't about firepower, it was about breaking predictability. The German defenders lost their ability to anticipate. Even seasoned Panzer commanders, who had once enjoyed the dominance of defense-in-depth tactics, were suddenly fighting a fluid enemy. Within days, German counterattacks faltered not because of a lack of courage, but because they could no longer read the battlefield. What the Allies had achieved through ingenuity, the Germans had lost through over-reliance on their environment. In every war, weapons carry emotional weight. For the American tank crews of Normandy, the M4 Sherman was a paradox, a machine both trusted and cursed. Its mobility was excellent, its reliability unmatched, but its armor was thin, and its gun often outclassed by the German 75mm and 88mm cannons. Crews knew that in a direct duel with a Panzer IV, Panther, or Tiger, survival was uncertain. By July 1944, faith in the Sherman had begun to erode. Soldiers nicknamed it the Ronson after the lighter. Lights first time. Then came the Rhino. It didn't make the Sherman invincible, but it changed how the Sherman fought. It gave it the element of surprise, the ability to strike first, to dictate terms. For the men inside, that change was everything. Tankers wrote home about the new attachments with pride. "We've got our own teeth now," one sergeant told a correspondent. Another said simply, "We can fight again." The Rhino cutter gave the Sherman its dignity back. It gave soldiers confidence in their machine and in themselves. That morale surge rippled across units. Infantrymen who had once hesitated to follow tanks through open fields now advanced shoulder to shoulder with them. Coordination improved. Fear ebbed. And as that confidence grew, so did momentum, both psychological and operational. When the first hedgerows fell to the Rhino-equipped Shermans, the sound of steel tearing through earth became the soundtrack of renewal. It wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a spiritual one. In war, sometimes the smallest inventions, a handful of steel prongs welded under a tank, can restore belief in victory, and that belief was about to be tested in full fury under the skies of the coming offensive. July 25, 1944, 09:38 hours. Normandy. Operation Cobra begins. The morning sky trembled with sound. From the Channel to St. Lo, the horizon vanished beneath a storm of aircraft, with 1,500 heavy bombers, 500 medium bombers, and over 350 fighter bombers. The ground shook as thousands of tons of ordnance tore open the German line along a narrow front west of St. Lo. For the men of the U.S. First Army, it was meant to be the hammer blow that would finally break them free from the hedgerows. But before they could advance, before the dust even settled, the tanks had to move. And this time, they had teeth. The WWII first wave of armored units, including the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, as well as elements of the 30th Infantry Division, stood ready behind the shattered tree lines. Each Sherman's hull glinted under the early light, its Rhino cutter still blackened from field welding. At 1100 hours, the order came, engines roared to life. The ground was soft, littered with debris and bomb craters, but the tanks moved anyway. As they advanced, each driver could feel the difference. No more climbing, no more scraping the hedgerow's crest. The prongs bit deep, tore through the earthen wall, and the tank surged forward, bursting into the next field like a charging bull. For the first time since D-Day, American tanks were dictating the pace of battle. In the chaos that followed, German defenses crumbled. Units of the Panzer Lehr Division, already devastated by the bombing, tried to regroup, but their communication lines were shredded, their trenches overturned. American armor pressed through field after field, breaching at random points, shattering any remaining pattern of defense. Tank commanders, who once advanced cautiously, now drove aggressively. Each hedgerow became a minor explosion. Soil, roots, and leaves bursting outward as the rhinos punched through. Infantrymen followed in the tank's wake, rifles up, moving faster than any German anticipated. By the end of the day, elements of the 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions had penetrated 2 miles beyond the original front. Reports flooded back to headquarters. Tanks operating with complete success. Hedge obstacles no longer a factor. One battalion after-action log noted simply, "Culin's cutters are saving lives." July 13, 1944. Near St. Lo, Normandy. The night smells of damp earth and gasoline. Rain drips from the dense hedgerows, the ancient bocage that has stalled an entire army. A Sherman tank idles in the darkness, its engine growling low, its tracks caked with clay and blood. Under a faint tarpaulin, a group of mechanics work by the dull orange of a welding torch. Sparks scatter across the mud, landing on torn German steel, sections of twisted beach obstacles dragged inland from Omaha and Utah. One man, sleeves rolled high, squints through his mask as the torch hisses. His name is Sergeant Curtis Culin, 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, U.S. First Army. Before him, a crude shape takes form. 4 sharpened prongs welded beneath the Sherman's bow, a weapon made not of factory precision, but necessity. Beyond the fields, muffled artillery rolls. American tanks sit trapped behind thick green walls, waiting for a way forward. If this works, they'll finally have one. By dawn, the mud-steeped silence will give way to the first test run. And within 72 hours, this field fix will turn hundreds of broken Shermans into Panzer killers. By the summer of 1944, the Allied war machine had breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall, but found itself caged by the countryside of Normandy. The invasion beaches, secured in June, had been a triumph of logistics and courage. Yet barely 10 miles inland, the character of war shifted. Gone were the open sands and clear lines of fire. Instead, the Allies confronted a labyrinth, the bocage. Each field was walled in by earthen embankments 4 to 6 feet high, topped with ancient hedges of tangled roots and branches thick as wrists. To the farmer, it was centuries of boundary and protection. To the soldier, it was a fortress. Sherman tanks, designed for the open expanses of Europe, found themselves blind and slow. Their tracks climbed the hedgebank, exposing their thin underbellies. German Panzerfaust teams, concealed in the next field, needed only seconds. Anti-tank shells and handheld rockets struck from point-blank range. Crews began to call it the Green Hell. By early July, the U.S. First Army's advance had nearly stalled. General Omar Bradley's divisions were bleeding for every hedged acre. Casualties mounted. Infantry pinned down. Armor immobilized. Artillery observation choked by the terrain. Entire battalions disappeared behind the foliage, lost to ambushes that came from 15 yards away. Reports described tanks unable to fire until fully exposed. Engineers tried dozer blades, but they bogged in soft ground. Others used explosives, but they were loud, slow, and predictable. Commanders demanded ingenuity, anything to regain momentum before the Germans could fully recover from the D-Day landings. By mid-July, the American push toward St. Lo had become a grinding contest of attrition. The German 352nd and 3rd Parachute Divisions held firm in the hedgerows, each field a miniature fortress. Tanks that had survived North Africa and Italy were now burning in the green thickets of Normandy. It was in this environment, mud, fatigue, and desperation, that Sergeant Curtis Culin began to think differently. Culin, a mechanic by trade and a soldier by necessity, served with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a unit of New Jersey National Guardsmen converted for armored warfare. Their job was to scout ahead. But in Normandy, ahead meant through living walls of vegetation. According to accounts later compiled by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, the spark of his idea came from a conversation in the field. One of his men, identified in various sources as a Tennessee soldier named Roberts, remarked half-jokingly that the tanks ought to carry saws to cut through the hedges. Culin thought differently. Not saws, but teeth, using salvaged steel from destroyed German beach obstacles, those angular Czech hedgehogs meant to stop landing craft. Culin and his crew began welding a prototype. Each tine was sharpened and reinforced, forming a rigid fork beneath the Sherman's hull. The principle was simple. Instead of climbing the hedgerow, the tank would pierce it, cutting a doorway, keeping its gun level, and maintaining the element of surprise. On July 14, 1944, the first test took place before a gathering of officers. The tank moved forward, the blades struck the hedgerow, and, to everyone's astonishment, the wall split open. The tank burst through with no loss of balance or traction. Behind it, A clean gap stood open wide enough for infantry to follow. Word spread fast. Bradley himself witnessed a demonstration days later. He later wrote that it was a stroke of inspired improvisation. The Rhino, as troops began to call it, promised what no higher command had yet achieved: a way to restore movement in the bocage. But a single prototype was not enough. The First Army now needed hundreds, in days, before Operation Cobra, the planned breakout from Normandy. To make that possible, an army of welders and ordnance men would have to perform a miracle of their own. And so, in the shadow of the St. Lo ruins, a new kind of battlefield production began, one that would weld ingenuity to momentum. The order came down quickly. General Omar Bradley, convinced by the field demonstration, directed that every available ordnance workshop in the U.S. First Army area begin immediate fabrication of Culin's hedgerow cutters. But this was no simple task. The front lines of Normandy were chaotic, constantly shifting under rain, mud, and shell fire. Factories did not exist here, only makeshift depots, barn workshops, and the tireless men of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. At the heart of this sudden industrial effort stood the 25th Ordnance Heavy Shop Company, commanded by Colonel John Medeiros, with logistical support from Colonel Holger Toftoy. Their mission: turn Culin's rough sketch into standardized, mass-producible kits and deliver them to the front before Operation Cobra began. Welding teams worked around the clock. Their raw material came not from supply depots, but from the ruins of the German Atlantic Wall. U.S. engineers scavenged beach defenses, cutting up captured steel, hedgehogs, and obstacles littering the invasion beaches. What had once been meant to keep Americans out of France was now being reforged to drive them deeper in. Each hedgerow cutter required about 350 pounds of steel and dozens of man-hours. Oxygen and acetylene for the torches were in short supply. So were welding rods. Medeiros's units filed urgent requisitions through every available channel. And when standard supply could not deliver fast enough, they scavenged, improvised, and even cannibalized damaged vehicles to extract components. By July 17, 1944, the 25th Ordnance and associated maintenance battalions began full production runs. In open fields behind the front, sparks lit the night like constellations. Welders crouched beneath tarpaulins as enemy aircraft occasionally droned overhead. Generators thumped. Crews slept in shifts beside their work, covered in soot and metal dust. Medeiros later described it as the closest thing to a front-line factory the Army had ever seen. The challenge wasn't just building the blades, it was delivering them. Each finished set had to reach a tank company already engaged in combat. Maintenance units drove through shell-pocked roads, sometimes under artillery fire, hauling bundles of steel welded into rough Rhino-like forms. At forward positions, tank crews themselves finished the fitting. Within 72 hours, over 500 Shermans were equipped. Some divisions, like the 2nd Armored and 29th Infantry's attached tank battalions, received cutters for nearly every operational vehicle. Others got only a handful, forcing commanders to distribute them strategically. 1 per platoon, or 2 per company. The cutter was crude but effective. 4 heavy tines projecting from the tank's lower glacis, welded at a slight downward angle. When the Sherman advanced, these tines would slice into the earthen wall, tear through the roots, and punch a hole large enough for the tank to burst through at speed. Suddenly, American armor could maneuver where the enemy thought it couldn't. As the American front surged forward, the contrast between old and new tactics was stark. Where units without Rhino tanks still bogged down, others advanced nearly unopposed. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7 Corps, later recalled how astonished he was by the tempo. "The hedgerows no longer stopped us," he wrote. "They fell before our armor as if they were paper." The operation, however, was far from simple. Despite the massive bombardment, coordination remained difficult. Some bombs had fallen short, killing U.S. troops near the front. Smoke, dust, and wreckage obscured vision. Yet through that chaos, the Rhino tanks found clarity. Their very purpose thrived in confusion. They didn't need clear roads or marked gaps. They made their own. As the day progressed, the 2nd Armored Division's spearhead drove deeper toward Marigny, meeting sporadic resistance. German counterattacks by elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, faltered. Without predictable crossing points, their ambushes missed the mark. The American armor appeared from unexpected directions, crushing machine gun nests under their treads before the Germans could even pivot. By July 26th, the breakthrough widened. Sherman after Sherman burst through hedges, forming wedges of armor that pushed faster than German command could react. The Rhino cutters, crude as they were, had become instruments of operational art. They allowed the First Army to exploit the breach immediately after the bombing, seizing the initiative before the Germans could reform a line. The synergy between strategic bombing and tactical mobility, two entirely different tools, finally materialized. In the words of one Ordnance Corps report, the Culin device transformed the nature of the hedgerow battle overnight. The difference between movement and stagnation was now measured in 4 pieces of welded steel. But every advance carried a cost. The fields the Rhinos crossed were littered with bodies, German and American alike. Burned tanks marked where cutters alone couldn't save a crew from a well-placed 88mm shell. Yet even amid loss, there was momentum. At dusk on July 26th, an officer of the 2nd Armored watched as a line of Rhino-fitted Shermans rumbled past the hedgerows near Hébécrivon. "It was like watching a tide," he said later. "You could feel the weight of history in motion." That night, in Bradley's command post, the maps were redrawn. Arrows stretched toward Coutances and Avranches, toward open ground. The breakthrough was no longer a hope. It was underway. The next 48 hours would decide whether this sudden mobility could be sustained, or whether the German reserves could seal the gap. July 27-30, 1944. The breakout expands by the 3rd day of Operation Cobra. The hedgerow country that had once strangled the Allied advance was coming apart. Smoke drifted low over the valleys. Burned panzers lay abandoned in the ditches. German defenses, once methodically layered, now looked fractured and chaotic. At the spearhead of this unraveling stood the Rhino-fitted Shermans of the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, grinding relentlessly through the countryside toward Coutances and Avranches. Everywhere, the same pattern repeated. A tank platoon halted briefly before a hedgerow, engines idling. The commander scanned for any sign of wire or mines, then gave a hand signal. The tank lurched forward, the Rhino's steel prongs biting into the base of the hedge. Dirt and roots exploded upward. The tank surged through, leveling its gun the instant it broke into the next field. Infantry poured through behind it, rifles ready, moving under the protective thunder of the 75mm. From the air, it looked like a violent mosaic. Fields once sealed by green walls now connected by jagged openings, like wounds stitched by movement. For the German defenders, chaos deepened. The Panzer Lehr Division, already shattered by the bombing, tried to mount local counterattacks, but their cohesion was gone. Tanks that had once dominated the narrow lanes now found themselves outmaneuvered. The enemy's maps, carefully drawn to predict Allied movements through known gaps, were useless. By July 28th, German intelligence reports admitted what their commanders already knew. Enemy tanks no longer respect field boundaries. Hedgerows offer no protection. The psychological collapse that followed was as decisive as the physical one. Soldiers who had spent weeks ambushing tanks from concealed positions now faced an enemy that appeared from anywhere. Panic spread. Communication broke down. Whole platoons fell back without orders. While chaos consumed the German line, the Americans adapted faster than their own doctrine predicted. Platoon leaders who had never rehearsed hedgerow breaches were now conducting them with practiced confidence. Coordination between armor and infantry reached levels unseen since the landings. In one recorded engagement near Hebecrevon, a company from the 30th Infantry Division advanced behind 4 Rhino Shermans. They broke through 3 successive hedgerows in under 10 minutes, eliminating 2 machine gun nests and a POC-40 anti-tank gun before the Germans could react. The after-action report noted, "Rhinos made the difference between a 2-hour fight and a 10-minute advance." The innovation had become invisible, no longer something noticed, simply something used. By July 29th, 7th Corps had broken fully into the open country west of St. Lo. The hedgerows thinned, giving way to rolling farmland. The tanks accelerated. Dust clouds rose behind them as they fanned out in long columns toward Coutances and Avranches. Bradley's staff realized the moment had come, the long-awaited breakout from the Normandy lodgment. Operation Cobra, after weeks of frustration, had become a storm. The Germans, desperate to seal the breach, committed their last reserves. The remnants of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Götz von Berlichingen counterattacked south of Perrier. But they struck into a fluid, moving enemy. Rhino-fitted Shermans and tank destroyers maneuvered around their flanks, using the hedgerow gaps they had created days earlier as improvised corridors. In several instances, German panzer units found themselves ambushed from directions they believed impassable. In one German report captured days later, an officer wrote, "The Americans no longer fight by the roads. They come through the ground itself." By July 30th, Avranches fell. The First Army was through. The gates to Brittany, and ultimately to France's interior, stood open. Culin's field invention had done more than pierce hedgerows. It had accelerated the collapse of the German defensive system in Normandy. Operation Cobra achieved what weeks of attrition could not: a decisive breakthrough. Within days, General George S. Patton's Third Army was unleashed through the gap, racing south and east, exploiting the corridor that the Rhino Shermans had carved. In total, more than 1,200 Rhino-fitted tanks participated in the breakout and pursuit operations that followed. Their contribution was acknowledged in every command report that followed. General Bradley later wrote, "It was a minor invention, but it helped us break the deadlock of the hedgerows and speed the liberation of France." Simple words, yet profound. For an army that had nearly bled itself dry in those tangled fields, speed was salvation. By early August, the momentum was unstoppable. Patton's tanks surged into Brittany. Others wheeled east toward the Falaise pocket. The Germans, trapped between converging Allied armies, faced annihilation. Behind that cascade of victory lay a single act of frontline ingenuity: a welding torch, a handful of steel prongs, and a mechanic's refusal to accept defeat. The Rhino cutter had changed not just a battle, but the tempo of a campaign. It turned the bocage from prison to passage. It turned fear into movement. The hedgerows of Normandy, once symbols of stagnation, now marked the point where Allied innovation overcame German preparation. And in that transformation, the balance of the Western Front had shifted forever. The hedgerow war ended not with a single battle, but with a change in momentum so profound that it altered the pace of the entire campaign in France. By early August 1944, the map of Normandy looked nothing like it had a month earlier. The static lines near Saint-Lô, Perrier, and Carentan had dissolved into sweeping arrows. The breakout, launched by Operation Cobra, had become a rolling pursuit. American armored columns poured through avalanches into the open plains of Brittany and the Loire Valley. German command, fragmented and reeling, could no longer form a coherent front. For those who had lived it, the change felt almost unreal. In June and early July, progress had been measured in yards, not miles. Entire companies fighting for a single hedged field. Now, the same soldiers were advancing 20 miles in a day. The difference lay not only in strategy or bombing, but in the newfound ability to move. Official U.S. Army Ordnance reports, compiled after Cobra's success, noted that between July 18th and August 1, more than 500 hedgerow cutters were produced and fitted by forward maintenance units. Additional workshops continued manufacturing them throughout August, bringing the total to over 1,200 by mid-month. That rate, hundreds of functioning field modifications produced under fire, was unprecedented in modern warfare. Colonel John Medeiros, overseeing production, later described the scene as an unbroken chain of torches. Crews worked night and day in barns, orchards, even roadside clearings, assembling devices from scavenged steel and spare track links. Bradley's staff estimated that roughly 60% of First Army tanks carried cutters during the Cobra breakout. Not every unit had them, and those that didn't were often the ones still delayed by the terrain. The contrast was unmistakable. Divisional reports praised the devices with terse understatement. Cutter worked well, recommended for all tanks operating in bocage. Improvised field fix saved considerable time and casualties. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself later remarked that Culin's innovation exemplified the spirit of American improvisation. Yet, beyond the official lines, the human testimony told the deeper truth. Tank crews who had survived the first weeks of hedgerow fighting spoke of the difference with quiet awe. "Before, you'd hit a hedge and pray," recalled one driver of the 743rd. Tank Battalion. Now you hit it, and it gave way. For the infantrymen, the change meant fewer ambushes, fewer casualties. They could follow armor into open ground instead of crawling through narrow gaps under fire. Morale soared. To the soldiers, the Rhino wasn't an invention from the top. It was something they made, they tested, and they proved. It was ownership in its purest form. Strategically, the success of Cobra and the breakout that followed reshaped the entire Western Front. Within 3 weeks, the Allied forces encircled and destroyed much of the German 7th Army in the Falaise Pocket, capturing or killing more than 40,000 enemy troops. France's liberation now moved on an unstoppable timeline. But behind the grand arrows and sweeping maneuvers lay the quiet influence of innovation. Without mobility in those first hedgerow fields, Cobra's initial thrust might have bogged down like every attempt before it. Historians later debated the precise impact of Culin's device, whether it was decisive or simply catalytic. But even the skeptics agreed. Without the Rhino, the breakout would have been slower, costlier, and far more uncertain. In the weeks that followed, the Ordnance Corps continued refining the design, though the need diminished as the landscape opened. The cutters were gradually removed or discarded. Their work was done. But for the men who drove those Shermans through Normandy's living walls, the memory lingered. Many later said that they had witnessed not just a victory of arms, but a victory of ideas. The Rhino had proven that a single soldier's imagination, backed by leadership willing to act, could shape the course of history. And in that, the United States Army learned a lesson it would carry into every war that followed. In the days after the breakout, the Normandy landscape changed color. Where once there had been endless green walls, the ancient hedgerows that had held up armies, there were now long scars of torn earth. Each gap marked a passage where a Rhino-fitted Sherman had forced its way through, where men and machines had wrestled the terrain itself into surrender. For the Germans, The aftermath was humiliation wrapped in disbelief. Their defensive masterpiece, built on the natural fortress of the bocage, had been undone not by superior tanks or numbers, but by a crude, improvised blade of steel. Captured German officers later spoke of the moment their tactical assumptions collapsed. One described it as a new kind of attack, without front or flank. Another, writing from captivity, admitted that after the hedgerows were breached, the ground ceased to favor us. The enemy's freedom of movement was complete. That freedom of movement, that return of initiative, had been the Americans' greatest need. As the First Army raced south, the Rhino name spread faster than the tanks themselves. Newspaper correspondents picked it up, and soon stories appeared in Stars and Stripes and on home front radio. GI Mechanics Field Fix turns tanks into hedgebusters, one headline read. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin, the man whose idea had sparked it all, suddenly found himself famous. Reporters tracked him down in a forward area, welding mask still hanging from his neck. When asked what he thought of his invention, he reportedly shrugged. It worked, he said simply. For his contribution, Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit, a rare honor for a non-commissioned officer in a frontline unit. But his story ended quietly. A few months later, during fighting in the Hurtgen forest, he was severely wounded and later invalided home. He never saw the war's end in Europe, though his name lived on in the reports, manuals, and memories of every man who had driven through a hedge with a cutter bolted to his tank. The Ordnance Corps documented the Hedgerow Cutter Project as a textbook example of battlefield innovation. Colonel John Medaris, reflecting after the war, described it as the purest expression of soldier-led invention, conceived, built, and deployed faster than any weapon before it. The lessons ran deep. The U.S. Army, still new to large-scale mechanized warfare, learned that adaptation could come from any level, not just from scientists or engineers. It reinforced a cultural truth that would echo through later conflicts, that success often depended on empowering the men closest to the problem. The Rhino episode became a teaching example in post-war military education. The Army's official ordnance history, on beachhead and battlefront, devoted an entire section to it, concluding that the hedgerow cutter saved untold casualties and materially contributed to the breakout from Normandy. That acknowledgement meant more than medals or headlines. It validated a philosophy, that victory was not only a matter of numbers, but of ideas, welded in the field under pressure and necessity. By September 1944, the hedgerow cutters were no longer needed. The front had moved far beyond the Norman countryside, into open plains where tanks could maneuver freely. Most units removed the Rhino blades to reduce weight and drag. The devices, so vital only weeks earlier, were discarded beside roads or melted down for other uses. But in photographs and films from those months, the image remains haunting. Long columns of Shermans, steel prongs glinting in the summer light, rolling through fields that had once seemed impassable. Behind them, Normandy's ancient hedges lay broken, symbols of how even the oldest obstacles can yield to new ideas. The First Army's momentum carried through France, across the Seine, and into Belgium. What had begun as a desperate adaptation in a muddy field became one of the great enablers of the Allied drive to liberation. When the war ended, few would remember the name Culin outside military circles. Yet every tank crewman who had crossed those fields knew his legacy. It wasn't just in the steel or the victories, but in the simple truth his invention had proven. That courage and creativity, bound together, could change the shape of war. In the quiet years that followed, as Europe rebuilt and the hedgerows grew back, farmers would sometimes find rusted fragments of those cutters buried beneath the soil. Silent remnants of a moment when human ingenuity turned the tide of history. Each shard, each piece of welded steel, told the same story. A mechanic's torch in the night, a tank reborn with teeth, and a battlefield transformed by the will to move forward. In the long memory of war, the great inventions often gleam with machinery and grandeur. The Spitfire, the V-2, the Sherman itself. But history's true revolutions are sometimes born not in laboratories or factories, but in mud, darkness, and the hands of men who refuse to stop thinking. The hedgerow cutter, the Rhino, was not beautiful. It was crude, jagged, and improvised. Yet it embodied the purest form of innovation, necessity sharpened by survival. It turned an ordinary tank into a tool of momentum, and momentum into victory. In just 72 hours, an army mechanic transformed battlefield frustration into battlefield freedom. His idea spread faster than any order, because it answered a soldier's simplest prayer: a way to move forward. The real power of Culin's creation was never the steel. It was the faith it restored. Faith in the Sherman, faith in the ingenuity of the common soldier, and faith in the idea that even in the chaos of war, human minds could still create rather than only destroy. Through the smoke of Normandy, that spark of creativity bridged the gap between despair and triumph. It reminded the world that progress is often the child of hardship, that every obstacle, no matter how immovable it seems, can be reimagined. When the tanks of the First U.S. Army rolled through the hedgerows, they weren't just breaking through German defenses. They were breaking through the limits of what soldiers believed possible. And in those brief days, between the welding sparks and the thunder of engines, the essence of modern warfare revealed itself. Not just strength, not just courage, but adaptation. Culin's cutters rusted away long ago, buried in the French soil they helped free. Yet their story endures. A reminder that history often turns on small hinges, on the quiet brilliance of ordinary people, and on the courage to turn an idea into action. In the end, the Rhino was more than a weapon. It was proof, forged in steel and fire, that even in the darkest corners of war, the light of human ingenuity still burns.